The Athletic.
The race is on, and while Red Bull took its third 1-2 of 2024 in the Japanese Grand Prix, it was a race of conflicting strategies in the scrap for the final podium place. But why was Verstappen still able to canter to victory even on a difficult weekend, and what explains the performance swings in the group behind? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us with all the answers are Mark Hughes and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, I'm obliged to ask, with this early race, tell me about the cherry blossom.
Obviously... change from the usual sort of towards the end of the season slot to early April means it has had a slightly different backdrop. It's been quite nice and scenic, actually. I will admit, though, I wasn't in the best place this week to actually check out the surroundings too much, but it looked quite pretty from the coach on the way in.
Yeah, it was very pretty. It's not just the cherry blossom, it's the fact that the sky is bright, bright blue, and I normally associate skies here as being a bit moody and grey and sometimes black. And it's still a great place to be, no matter what time of the year.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of it when you come here normally. That you're right, when it's that kind of like milky white, greyish kind of backdrop to everything, and it's the sheer brutality and awesomeness of the circuit that shines through. But it's had a bit more of a picturesque backdrop this week, so it's been quite lovely.
So it's like the contrast has just been shunted up compared to usual.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, the main picture is the same picture. It's just slightly different contrast.
Excellent. Well, it's a great time of year to have the race. Certainly an improvement. It created an interesting one. So, Mark, let's get on with it, because it was the most intriguing race of the season, with strategic divergence and all three tyre compounds proving viable options. So how did it play out?
Yes, there was one stops and two stops were failed one stops, so converted into two stops by Mercedes. It played out with Verstappen winning with a standard two-stop. Red Bull had saved two sets of mediums and only one hard, same as Ferrari had done. That probably increased their advantage a little bit. The medium was probably a slightly better tyre than the hard. Mercedes and McLaren had saved the only one set of medium and two hards. So, obviously Verstappen ran away in a race of his own, as he usually does. But the race behind was quite intriguing, and it was obviously taken by the runner-up spot was taken by Perez, quite some distance behind Verstappen. But he kept under pressure by Sainz's Ferrari, and if Sainz had not been stuck behind Lando Norris in the first stint, which was a result of being out-qualified by Lando Norris, I think he could have put some real pressure on at the end. He was seriously quick at the end of the race, but he just a little bit too far behind and sort of ran out of laps. But he'd lost something like, probably 6-7 seconds in that first stint, being stuck at Norris's pace. The Ferrari was definitely the second fastest car here, even though Lando qualified. Lando's third P3 in qualifying made McLaren the second fastest officially in qualifying. And the McLaren boss Andrea Stella was explaining that over a single lap on new soft tyres, some of the car's shortcomings are sort of disguised a little bit, and so like the slow corner performance and the hairpin especially. But as soon as you start putting a number of laps on the tyres, then that weakness becomes apparent. And the Ferrari was clear number two behind the Red Bull. And Sainz did a great job on a conventional two-stop. Ran really, really hard once he got some clear air, and was just very, very impressive throughout. Leclerc ran for an absolute age doing a one-stop. He fully intended to do a one-stop despite starting on the medium. And he managed to get it to run. Well, in fact, he made his first and only stop on the same lap as Norris made his second stop. And so, Leclerc was able to defeat Norris and take fourth place. But that was partly because of how early Norris had been forced to pit at the first stops by the undercut pressure put on him by Sainz. So that was the competitive picture, really. Red Bull, then Ferrari, then McLaren. and then behind them a quite evenly matched Mercedes Aston Martin lineup with that was really just decided upon Merck's abandoned one-stop strategy and Alonso going through in a two-stop.
And obviously, as you say, Red Bull was still conclusively ahead. Scott, is there any disappointment? We had hoped maybe McLaren might be a little bit closer. They were closer than they were last year, but not close enough to be a factor. And then Ferrari was quicker than them in the race. So is it a little bit disappointing there wasn't a bit more of a hint of a threat? Or, as Mark alluded to, do you think, well, perhaps if the race had played out differently, we might see a bit more from Ferrari maybe?
There's a bit of a disappointment from the McLaren side, I think, just because just coming into the weekend for starters, a lot of expectation based off the fact that this was where McLaren was so strong last year. Because it's not a track that Ferrari shone on previously, I think if anything, they'd be pleasantly surprised with what they've achieved this weekend. So it depends. It depends how you look at it. I don't see any team reflecting on the weekend as, that was a missed opportunity to tackle Red Bull, for example. Lando Norris seemed to feel that actually, if anything, he'd overachieved on the Saturday. So actually just regressed to where the car should have been on the Sunday. So no race-specific disappointment for him because it was about where the car should have been. Maybe that bigger picture of disappointment for McLaren in that they've been usurped on the track where they were strongest last year behind Red Bull. I would imagine it is a source of some frustration, disappointment and motivation to have lost out to Ferrari here, because I feel like for all of the talk of needing to improve in the areas that they're weak, particularly slow speed corners, and that mitigating elements of how it has started the season, in Bahrain in particular, there was this trend of it getting better and being on a nice trajectory as it went on a run of circuits that were increasingly more suited to the car. But we've just come here where this is probably the McLaren at its peak and it's still been beaten by Ferrari over a race distance. So it just cements the fact that McLaren is third best, which is a pretty good place to be cemented. But when you start third and you run the first stint third, I'm sure Norris would have wanted a better result than what he got.
Would you say, Mark, the strategic variance we saw was revealing of anything, or does it just follow on from FP2 being a wet session and the fact that race day was a lot warmer than anything we'd seen in practice?
It's a very, very high deg circuit at the best of times, and the increased track temperature put some extra strain on the tyres and also left the teams even more clueless about how it might unfold because of the restricted running on Friday FP2. So I don't think there are any real surprises there. There was, when you need a second a lap advantage on this track to overtake. So in your first stint, when everybody's on the same age tyres, nobody overtakes. You get in position and you just run at that pace or whatever that pace is, and just try and look after your tyres, and then try and nudge up towards the undercut or defend from the undercut as that window opens for the first pit stop. And as you get a bit of variance between the new tyres and the old tyres, because the degradation rate is so high, the new tyres are massively faster than the old tyres. And then you see lots of overtaking. But it doesn't really mean much. It just sort of just determines the way the race plays out rather than it changing much. I mean, you are seeing people overtaking in the S's and all those things. It was great. It looks fantastic. But it's just really a function of high tyre deg and variation in strategy.
Was the distance between the Ferraris by the end of the race smaller than it should have been? Because I did wonder if I think Leclerc did a fantastic job maximising that strategy. And
he did, yeah. I think, but you got to counter that. You got to bear in mind that Sainz had lost a lot of time in the first stint behind Norris. But I think both Ferrari drivers did a great job.
Because the way that Sainz had to play that race, obviously he was in that position in the first stint where he was being contained, and then I guess once he gets in, I think he extended both his stints, didn't he?
Yeah.
So there's that element of almost playing a little bit of chess and managing the tyres, plus trying to work out. I felt like he was always trying to work out who his race was with, because there was that point where it's like, actually, you can see you can see Perez is in that picture because of the way that the undercut worked in the first stint for Norris in particular. But you've got a kind of the second Red Bull kind of tantalisingly, that seemingly within reach at stages of the race. You've got the McLaren that you're racing early on. All of a sudden, Leclerc's in the picture because of his strategy. And at the end of the race, I think Sainz even had to ask, didn't he?
He did, yeah. So he was catching Lando pretty quickly, and Lando just in front of him was Charles. And so he obviously realised that, actually, I'm going to pass these two. I've got the speed to pass these two. And he said, am I racing here? They said, yeah, you're racing for a podium. And so, yeah, he was easily able to pass Lando and was allowed pass by Leclerc. And then he got on and chased Checo. But as I said, he was a little bit too far behind by then.
You know, you've got an intriguing race strategically when even Carlos Sainz is losing track of it a little bit. But of course, he was ahead by some margin of Leclerc in qualifying because Leclerc was struggling, he thought, with the tyre prep. And he joked after the race, I don't normally have to worry about qualifying. But we saw a similar thing in slightly different circumstances in Australia. So that's an interesting thing to track in terms of Leclerc's progress. Yeah,
the one thing I would say on that is obviously I know exactly what you mean by that, Ed, because it was the trailing of him, of Sainz through qualifying that was so striking for Leclerc, wasn't it? And the big deficit to begin with. In the end, the final margin wasn't actually that significant, was it? It was, what was it, just over a tenth. That obviously added up to 4 places on the grid. But I think you messaged me on Saturday, and I might have actually stolen that bit of phrasing in a piece that we wrote on the website, or paraphrased you. But the way that Leclerc was talking after Saturday, and to a lesser extent on Sunday as well, you'd have think he'd just had some kind of career-ending qualifying shocker, and he was a 10th from the second row of the grid and his teammate. But it was all part of this issue that he feels it was there in Melbourne as well. I don't know. He definitely specified from Melbourne. I don't know if he battled it to a degree in Bahrain or Jeddah. Maybe not, because of the nature of those 2 tracks. It wasn't too much of a problem to generate the tyre temperature, but feels like something was missing on the tyre prep side. So he has just been chasing a bit of feeling and confidence in qualifying, which, as you mentioned, he said he doesn't normally have to worry too much. The 1-lap pace is his forte, and I thought it was quite. He'd have much rather obviously just had the great qualifying session and raced from 4th on the grid, because who knows what he could have achieved based on the way he played that race. Maybe he had the pace to beat Perez and split the Red Bulls. But I think we discussed this during the race, Ed. Kind of nice in a way to have it this way, because it was a good reminder from Leclerc of the people who are a bit simplistic about his skill set sometimes, that he's got that kind of time management race in his locker, hasn't he?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He's shown it many times in the past. It's true to say that sometimes when things get a bit tricky with the tyres, and in qualifying in particular, he can lose out a bit to Sainz in terms of putting it all together. But he's not an idiot. He's a very capable driver. It's just sometimes the complexities he doesn't deal with quite as well as Sainz. It's a small difference, but he does have these very, very strong race drives. He's not just driving really fast over a race stint and gets a good result. There's a lot more to his art than that. We should talk a little bit more about Perez though, Scott, because he admitted Suzuka last year was probably his nadir, but he pushed Verstappen hard in qualifying, took his second place in 4 races. So how convinced are you by his progress?
I think he started the season very well. I think Helmut Marko did him a little bit of a disservice in weekend when he said that he's only driving like this because it's contract renewal season.
Yeah, I felt that was he was really trying last year, Perez. If anything, he was trying too hard.
Yeah, exactly. So I think
it's always contract renewal season for him, isn't it?
Yeah,
you only get 1 year at a time.
That's just the way for Red Bull drivers, really, isn't it? Every race can be your last race.
Yes, that's true. Maybe that's the key, is not give anyone a contract. Give everyone like a rolling 3-month contract. That's the way to get the most out of them. No, and obviously there was another form of motivation for Checo this weekend in some kind of what seemed to be reasonably staked bet between himself and Christian Horner, which seemed to be about whether he could qualify on the front row, which is exactly what he did. His pace versus Verstappen in qualifying was very strong. The race performance, as ever, it bleeds away a little bit because it's that relentlessness over a Grand Prix. So that's what Verstappen loves. You know, you might think Verstappen as someone who just wants to get out there and absolutely nail a lap, because he's a kind of classic racer at heart, and classic racers love qualifying and putting the car on the limit. Max just loves stringing together an hour and a half's worth of mega laps. He knows that anybody on that grid can do a mega one-off qualifying lap, but doing it over a Grand Prix distance, that's the trick. So Perez, does lose out. If you're slower over one lap, you're going to be slower over 50 odd laps, aren't you? But I think he's doing not just what Red Bull needs him to do. I think he's actually doing more than that right now. And I would argue, even though the results are less impressive, I think this is actually a better start to the season for Perez than last year, because I feel like the pace is a little bit more convincing.
Yeah, absolutely. He's doing what he needs to do. So he's making his case to stay on. Only 4 races in, but I like his approach. I think he's not overreaching. By his own admission, he's not doing that and looking for things that maybe aren't there and trying to be too clever with the setup. He's back to basics and he's delivering. He's building on that little hint of progress at the back end of last year. Right, Mark, we've had our first dose of Fernando Alonso talking himself up spectacularly of this season. He described his 6th place from 5th on the grid as inside the top 5 ever for me. I mean, his top 5 list by his recent statements probably includes about 50 weekends, but he was about 15 seconds behind Norris and finished 6th. So has he got a point?
He drove a very good race. He drove a typically feisty and cunning Alonso race. But he's best. He's top 5. He's driven some staggeringly good races over his career. So, no, I don't think so. But yeah, very, very impressive. Very smart. He did the DRS trick when he had Russell on newer tyres coming up behind Piastri, who was just behind him. He knew that if Russell got by Piastri, you would be able to get by him as well. So he did that Carlos Sainz and Singapore trick of helping the other guy by backing off and letting them use the DRS to prevent them coming by. He qualified the car, about where it should have been, and he ran a slightly offset tyre strategy, started on the softs, made it work. It was a very, very good race. It was a faultless race, but a great race involves doing something extraordinary. I don't think he did anything extraordinary. He was just very, very good. A par for the course. Alonso, very, very good.
Yeah, his rationale for why he rated it so highly was that he feels that car is firmly 5th fastest. So his logic is that he's significantly overachieving over one lap and then in the Grand Prix itself as well. What do you think, Ed, he said when I asked him how he comes to that ranking?
He will... that's an interesting question. I think he probably just thought, I'm Fernando Alonso, of course it's brilliant. And then if you actually presented him with a list of races, he'd have a bit of trouble. And he'd say, well, they're all equal first.
I mean, how do you think he came to the ranking of the pecking order, the teams?
Oh, the pecking order. Well, I think, I think the Mercedes was quicker. And because Hamilton could have been ahead in qualifying, couldn't he? So I think that's perfectly reasonable.
So I was trying to get him to basically, is it based on others underachieving? Is it based on, when everybody pieces together their best laps, you've got 4 cars that should be ahead of you, but you're so good at piecing together your best laps that you're overachieving. But you can see in the data, you can see in the ideal lap times that Aston Martin only has the 5th fastest car. Fernando didn't say any of that. He cut me off mid-question and then just said, because I'm the one driving the car.
Well, he has a fair point, but equally, if you look at the ideal sectors in qualifying, he put together his 3 best sectors when it mattered. Not many of the other leading drivers in the front-running teams managed to do that. So it's one of the things with Alonso. He says these really grand things, and while you may argue it's not in his top 5 because that's pretty competitive, he did have a really good weekend. I haven't done my full driver rankings working out, but he's certainly in the pot of drivers who's competing for number 1 for the weekend. I haven't done the full analysis, but he couldn't have done much more, certainly.
He's in your top 5?
He's certainly in my top 5. I think that's a fairly likely prediction unless I find something unexpected. I like to do a little bit of in-depth race pace study and that kind of thing. But anyway, let's talk about Mercedes now, Scott, because it seemed to be a case of more of the same for them, with George Russell 7th, Lewis Hamilton 9th. But there was actually some positivity from within the camp. And I'm going to bring in a question from the Race Members Club now from Owain Thomas as it tackles this topic well. He asks, why was there so much talking up of Mercedes' performance this weekend when they seemed just as unconvincing in qualifying in the race?
There were absolutely just signs and trends of this weekend that we've seen over the first 3. I understand that completely, and I don't think anyone can hide from it, and Mercedes wouldn't either. If you look at it purely on paper, it's another weekend that involves going very quickly during practice, fading a bit through qualifying, and ending up having a relatively mediocre result. That's not something that you can hide when your cars start and finish the race 7th and 9th. That just is what it is. I think the difference is that one, the Mercedes had a better baseline from the start of the weekend that then carried through the weekend. The car behaviour didn't seem to change nastily. It didn't seem to fall away from them session to session. There wasn't any inexplicable drop-off in performance. Lewis Hamilton wasn't thrilled with what he said was a car that felt very bad in the Grand Prix, but that seemed to just be a function of higher than expected tyre degradation rather than the car sort of suddenly falling out of a performance window or a sweet spot in perhaps the way it has at other events. This was off the back of a lot of work coming into the weekend after Melbourne, establishing a better way of setting the car up and preparing the tyres to use them in a way that didn't overstress the rear axle, because Mercedes' theory basically at the moment seems to be, in really simplistic terms, that they haven't been getting the most out of the tyres to consistently maximise the car's performance. They seem to have ruled out any missing aerodynamic performance that the numbers say should be there but isn't there. I think that is something that had certainly been not just hinted but outright stated at earlier races. That doesn't seem to be what they're looking at now. It's more that they have the aerodynamic performance they're expecting, but they don't have the cornering speed and the lap time that they're expecting to go with it. The car is not as fast in reality as it is in the virtual world, and I've checked, and that is to an abnormal degree, because I don't think anyone's car is as quick in reality as it is in the virtual world, because the virtual world is perfect and has a lot less variables. So with all that in mind, the reason there's encouragement and a bit more positivity about Mercedes is because they feel that they had that better baseline. They understand how to keep the car in that sort of sweet spot a little bit better, or not knock it out of that sweet spot. They feel that they've at least now established where the car is. Now that's not good. The car being what seems to be fourth fastest is not good for a team of Mercedes' size, its resources and its ambitions. But what they were looking for from this weekend is more of an accurate reference. Where do they need to start adding performance? What are their actual problems? They feel like that is what they have a better understanding of now. They need more than one race to actually get a convincing sample set to underline that. And then beyond that, they need to actually prove that they can then add performance in the areas they need it. But that's why there is this air of encouragement around what looks like an otherwise routinely mundane result and performance.
The one thing that was interesting, Mark, is on Sky Sports, Toto Wolff said that we'd have been racing for a podium, perhaps with a normal strategy. That seemed a bit bold.
I think that's probably stretching it a bit, but it was quite conceivable that with a better lap, Lewis could have qualified fourth. And from there, with the correct strategy, which obviously you only know in hindsight, yeah, he probably could have been fighting for a podium. But as starting from P7, no, I don't think they would have been fighting for a podium, even with a better strategy.
I would say that I'll accept there's genuine reasons for them to be happy with the progress, because everything's recalibrated there, hasn't it? We're not expecting Mercedes to be challenging Red Bull or anything, or being second best. This is judged by where they were in the first three races, and at least they've made some kind of encouraging progress, although we want to see if there's those fluctuations in form from track to track they're not expecting. But at least they seem like they've got a little bit more of a handle on what's going on. And then, of course, yeah, it was just undone by the strategy not being great in the race. So still nowhere near good enough, but the first thing you look for with any team is, are they moving in a positive direction? And they've turned into a positive direction this weekend. Whether it'll be enough, whether it'll get them much further is another question, but gently positive, I think, is the way I'd describe the weekend. Mark, Yuki Tsunoda, he bagged his second consecutive points finish. That's his first top 10 on home soil as well. How impressed were you with him?
Yeah, perfect weekend, really. Didn't put a foot wrong. He was very, very marginally faster than Ricciardo in qualifying, which was the difference between getting into Q3 and not, but he was the one that did it. And, yep, just put together a very, very good race. Alternately aggressive and sort of calm as required and needed at various phases of the race. And a good defence at the end to hang on to that point from Hülkenberg. So, yeah, I mean, he's doing everything that could be asked of him, really.
I like the fact this was a slightly more complicated race than Australia was for him, which is good because he dealt with it well, as you alluded to there, which is what we always look for with Tsunoda. He was talking about before the last race about having brain overheating moments and things in races and his need to do that. His phrase, not mine. But it's really positive when you see this kind of in control. It would have been very easy just to trip over and make a little error somewhere and end up 11th or 12th rather than grabbing that final point. So, yeah, very, very positive for him. Scott, we should talk about his teammate, Daniel Ricciardo, a bit as well, because the race was red flagged on the first lap thanks to a crash involving Ricciardo and Alex Albon at turn 3. Stewards took no action. What did you make of it?
Yeah, so it was... I think Daniel caused it. I think it was slightly careless on his part. I agree with there not being a penalty because there is an established situation on the first lap with a bit more leniency because there's a lot more going on. And if you were racing, even if this was a 3-car fight later in the Grand Prix, I suspect Ricciardo could have got a penalty. The steward said that the two key factors were the fact it was on the opening lap and the fact there was a third car involved. I don't think the third car being involved, that's Lance Stroll on the left-hand side, who was actually behind Ricciardo, and it was just his presence that was a problem. He wasn't actually involved in the incident itself. I don't think that would have actually been enough of a mitigating circumstance later in the Grand Prix, because I think later in the Grand Prix, when it's less settled, there's less adrenaline, it's less frenzied because it's not the opening lap and the first couple of corners. I think the expectation on Ricciardo having a slightly better grasp of his surroundings on both sides would be greater, and therefore you're judging the incident differently. Judging this one in isolation, it seems pretty clear to me. Ricciardo gets a bit of a snap on the exit of turn 2. He's aware of Stroll starting to show his nose on the left-hand side, so he's focused on that. You can see him looking in his mirror. Then he moves back across to the right, partly because he's making sure he leaves Stroll room, partly because I think he knows that he's clear of Stroll and can take the racing line into the next corner. And because he's been so preoccupied with Stroll in his left side mirror, he hasn't seen Albon approach on the right side. Albon is not trying to do some kind of Hail Mary, hang it round the outside, overtake at that point. He's going in a straight line. There's a gap. There's a significant momentum difference, so he's perfectly entitled to put his car there. And he actually realised before Ricciardo that there was an accident coming, and he braked and tried to get out of it. By that point, Ricciardo had moved over too quickly. They collide, fly into the barriers. Another massive crash for Williams. Another load of damage. So much so that Albon said he was on his way into the tyres and he was thinking, this isn't going to be good for us. We don't need this now. So yeah, I'm not fussed about there not being a penalty, but yeah, I struggle to side with some of the interpretations I saw of the incident, indicating that Albon was, in some way doing wrong by putting his car where he did.
Yeah, there's always an element of risk in any kind of positioning, but he was kind of where the way the first couple of corners played out put him ultimately. And I wouldn't have penalised Ricciardo absolutely. I'd describe it as a little bit careless because I never like it when on the first laps of races people move across the track and then say, I didn't see them. And it's like, well, you didn't check and it's the first lap of the race and there's a lot of cars around. So you kind of need to. But it's difficult. There's a lot going on. He was looking to say, it happens. It was an honest mistake. So, yeah, I certainly wouldn't like to see it being penalised. But, yeah, just the last thing that Williams needed ultimately, just absolute agony for them, and chassis having to go back to be potentially patched up a bit again. It doesn't sound like it's anywhere near as bad as the Australia damage, but it's hard to tell.
Yeah, it is hard to tell, especially because, as Albon pointed out, the car stopped quite suddenly because of the nature of the way it went into the barrier, and then so that's the kind of thing that all that energy would have gone into the chassis, and it's so easy then for the pickup point to puncture a hole or dent the tub or whatever. So that's why it has to go back to Grove. I mean, that's significant in itself because it's another hefty freight job. My suspicion is because those cars were meant to come straight here from Melbourne. One didn't, the one that Sargent ended up racing, because Albon crashed that one in Melbourne in practice. That one went back to the UK, got fixed, and then came back out. So I imagine it's the same situation now. Both cars should be going on to China from here, but now one of them is going to have to go back to Grove to be patched up. And as best as I can understand it, because I know roughly where they were at after the first two crashes, that's Albon's in Melbourne and Sargent's in practice here, they were already pushing $2 million worth of crash damage coming out of the budget cap. That's repairs, parts production, but obviously also freight costs and whatnot in terms of the sort of extra emergency measures you need to take to then get all of that sorted. So now you're going to be looking at probably easy $2.5 million, I'd imagine, that's coming out of Williams' cost cap. They all have a provision in the cost cap. They build in that bit of a damage buffer, but I would imagine Williams is a very, very, very long way into that allowance now, and they've done it 4 races into the season. So this is borderline worst case scenario, especially once you factor in where they've happened. In Australia, then back to the UK, back out to Japan, now back to the UK, and then back to China again. It's an absolute nightmare. And they still don't have a spare because of all of this.
Yeah, spare's coming in Miami now. Originally, I think it was going to be China, they thought, in Australia. But yeah, Miami now. And of course, Logan Sargent had a shunt at turn 7 mark on Friday, which kept him out of the rest of the running. I think that was on his first flying lap as well, which won't have helped. But he's frustrating, Sargent, isn't he? Because he had that mistake on the Friday. And then looked at qualifying, he was running the old spec front wing. You thought, well, all right, pace deficit, not bad recovery. And then the race actually was going quite nicely. And then, of course, he goes off at Degner. It sort of summed up Logan Sargent in a weekend of there's bits where you say, oh, actually, this could be going somewhere. And then it's, oh, right, there's 2 big needless errors.
Yeah, it's just that nearly always, it's never quite gets converted. And, a long way into his second season now. I don't think it's really happening for him, and it's not easy circumstances. We know that. You have to make some allowance for that, but it's very, very difficult to see him clawing his way sort of back into making a case for himself that he must be on the F1 grid next year.
Yeah, ultimately he's in the car. He's got the opportunity. He can still turn it round, and yeah, he'll just be hoping that he can do it. Shall we have a little bit of Sauber chat now? I think we should.
Welcome to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner.
Right, Mark, Valtteri Bottas, he felt this was his and Sauber's strongest weekend. Once again, it was one in which a point was possible, given he was ahead of Yuki Tsunoda in that middle stint. So what went wrong, and how sympathetic are you to Valtteri this week?
Oh, totally sympathetic. This is a very valid entry into Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner. The car had a new floor, it was significantly improved. He had some decent pace, and yes, I think he could well have been in the points had things gone more smoothly. They still haven't got a full fix on for the wheel nuts, and although this time the pit stops didn't go disastrously wrong, they were still pretty pedestrian by the standards of, the cutting edge in Formula One, sort of 4 seconds, that sort of time. And so coming in at the same time as everybody else, obviously he lost out. And because it's, I think maybe they should have just concentrated on doing their own, their own sequence and not worrying too much about undercutting or defending from undercutting, because if you're going to be taking 2 seconds longer than everybody else to do a pit stop, you're going to either be undercut or not prevent yourself being undercut. So, another entry.
That was a pretty cool sight, though, wasn't it? When they all came into the pits and it was a crunch moment. Yuki Tsunoda was absolutely delighted after that.
Yeah, you don't get many of those kind of old school pit stop battles anymore. The pit stops are a little bit too short to allow that, but obviously, yeah, with Sauber adding a few seconds to their pit stop time, it makes that possible. It was a shame because actually in that middle stint, Bottas had done quite well. He'd done a little bit better than Tsunoda in terms of, because there was some traffic in the form of those who'd yet to stop, and he'd given himself a little bit of a margin, and yeah, it was coming together well. And it's a shame because Australia Bottas drove really well, Suzuka as well, and yeah, there again he is pointless. So yeah, lots of sympathy. That's 4 visits to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner for us this year in in the first 4 races, and I really appreciate Valtteri doing that jingle for us, and I like the fact he's given us an excuse to use it, but he's going a bit too far. Let's hope the next race for him goes a little bit better. Right, now it's time for questions from the Race Members Club. As always, thanks for your support. If you'd like to find out more about the Race Members Club and the various benefits of joining, see the link in the description of this episode or check out our website. And remember, you can also sign up via Apple Podcasts. Mark, the first question I'll aim for you. It's a double question. The first from Ollie Emerson, who says, could Charles Leclerc have threatened for second place if he'd started higher up the grid? And from Alexander Law, why was Leclerc able to maintain pace for a very long time on the medium tyre?
Could he have threatened for second had he qualified better? Yes, I think he probably could, but he didn't qualify better, and it was to do with he didn't do a very good first run in Q1, and so had to use another set another set of soft tyres, so he only had the one set for Q3. And that's not the first time that's happened recently. So it's, that's all part of the game. So, yes, had he done better, he would have done better. The other one was, what was the second part?
How he managed to go so long on the mediums when most others
couldn't.
Yeah,
I mean, he was able to go a long time on the mediums. He's very good at tyre conservation and combining that with pace. The Ferrari is now very good on the tyres. Plus, he wasn't under any undercut threat from behind, so there's no reason why you had to come in any earlier than the absolute last moment, and therefore give yourself a bigger tyre offset into the second stint. And so, that made that one stint feasible, and he was able to make that soft tyre last far longer at a better pace than the Mercedes drivers were able to make the hard.
Scott, a question for you now on a related topic from Mark Malipard, who says Ferrari's strategies were determined by Saturday's results, but who actually had the better race drive, Sainz or Leclerc?
Oh, it's really difficult. Sainz did very, very well. Sainz had the better weekend. I was really impressed with Leclerc's drive, so I would probably rate Leclerc's Grand Prix better, because that first stint I thought was fantastic. I then thought he was doing a really good job. Yes, okay, so he was helped by the timing of that McLaren pit stop with Lando Norris. I don't know about iReview, but I was absolutely stunned when Norris followed him into the pits. I know he'd got the call, but I assumed he'd be given a box opposite. Don't follow Leclerc in. But basically, I just thought Leclerc's driving, his time management, his speed when he needed it was absolutely brilliant. So I'd give Sainz the higher mark for the weekend and Leclerc a slightly higher mark for the Sunday.
He did have that moment at Degner too, though. That's the only real criticism for Sunday.
He did. That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. But it didn't cost him anything, did it, in the final result? So I might not let him off, but I might not mark him down too much for it.
Fair. Well, the next question I'll take from Jacobus VDL, who says, what has qualifying and race pace at the 2024 Japanese Grand Prix told us about the rate of development of the team since last year's race? Which teams have made the biggest steps and who the least? Well, if you look at the qualifying pace, which is the most accurate measure we've got because everybody's going flat out on low fuel, Aston Martin actually took the biggest step in terms of the performance improvement with a 1.874 second gain. Then Sauber, Haas and Mercedes. Actually, the smallest was Red Bull, which I think partly reflected the fact that Verstappen was struggling a little bit to get the absolute most out of everything in the tyres and things in qualifying. So, as always, when it's just sort of one comparative data point, it doesn't tell you everything, but it was a useful little benchmark because the last Japanese Grand Prix was only 6 months ago. And it's also the first time we've had a comparison on absolutely identical tyres because there was that small tyre construction change at Silverstone in the middle part of last year. But yeah, certainly interesting to see Aston Martin, who were of course struggling a lot at this stage last season, taking the biggest step, but still not being in an overall great position, requiring the miracle of Fernando Alonso to get sixth place, as he explained. Mark, a question for you from Simon Townend, who says, I was quite surprised by how willing Lewis was to let George by. Were there other factors at play, or has he just lost the bottle for a fight? And similarly, Simon Toms asks why Lewis volunteered to let George through, and is that a signal his motivation is low?
No, I don't think it's either of those things. I think Lewis was still very, very seriously trying to stay on course for the one stop. He could feel the tyres were degrading pretty quickly, the fronts especially, and he just reasoned that there's no way I can stay on this strategy if I'm having to do the pace that George is forcing upon me, so I might as well let him by. Maybe George at that point had realised a one stop's never going to work. I just need to get past because there's going to be a two stop anyway. We don't know what George was thinking, but that was Lewis's thoughts as to why he surrendered the place. He didn't feel it was feasible to run at any harder and still stay on a one stop, which he was told was the plan. That was why they'd put the hards on at the restart.
And it's funny because it's a good example of just how you can see this exactly the same incident in completely contrasting ways, because the flip side of how you can view what Lewis did is that there's absolutely no question of his what's the word, not loyalty as such, but his willingness to play the team game. Even though he's in his final year at Mercedes, even though things aren't going particularly well, he wasn't particularly fussed about sacrificing himself in that specific moment. Obviously, he had his own interests at play, as Mark was explaining, but he didn't need to volunteer it. He didn't need. I'm sure he would have ceded to the order if it had come from at Mercedes' behest rather than his own. I'm not pushing that position particularly. I just know that there are people who viewed it that way. So it's just interesting. That some people could interpret it as Lewis isn't up for it, and others could just say, well, look at that, he's still being a team player. It's just an interesting way that this kind of thing can just be flipped depending on the perspective.
Next question for you, Scott, from Kevin Hagerman, who says, was Fernando Alonso's pace advantage over Mercedes genuine, or was it just caused by the failed one-stop attempt? I'm also wondering if the now even bigger performance gap between Alonso and Stroll is caused by Stroll not being able to improve with the car, just like Perez did the last 2 seasons with Red Bull.
Oh, well, surely the pace advantage was just Alonso's outright brilliance in this Grand Prix, as we've joked about a couple of times. No, Fernando was excellent in this race.
It would be far less funny if he wasn't brilliant. It's that amazing fact with him, as I think I've mentioned before, that he's so brilliant, but he needs to tell everyone. There's something fascinating psychologically about that. But anyway, answer the actual question rather than listening to my nonsense.
I'll always listen to your nonsense, Ed. No, I think it was...
Well, you have to.
Yeah, that's true. Only for another 10 minutes or so at least. I think with this situation, it depended. There were parts of the Grand Prix where the Aston was quick and was quicker than it has been in previous races, where it has struggled actually on Sunday relative to Saturday. I think once Mercedes got onto a more conventional strategy, we saw that the Mercedes was the faster car. So I think Alonso was just making hay while the sun shone in the majority of the race, and then did an excellent job holding on at the end. The fact that he was able to keep Oscar Piastri at arm's length throughout, he said, you can never be 100% sure that you'll be confident, that you'll be clear right until the end, because you don't know how the tyres are going to drop off, or if Russell's going to be able to maintain that charging pace until the end of the Grand Prix. But they were, he just did a good job. He was excellent when the car was quicker, or the strategy was quicker, and then he'd done the hard work by the time the Mercedes was the faster car or on the faster strategy. As for Stroll, I think there is something in that. I think it's quite clear that Stroll is a bit more vulnerable or sensitive to the car changing. When the car's in a good window for him, like it was in Melbourne, he's not actually that far off Alonso. He was on a good level versus Alonso in Melbourne, and he's done that a few times, plenty of times in their time together as teammates. His problem is that he can go missing during a weekend, and he can be thrown off his game quite easily. So I think for this one, it was a little bit of the latter. He never seemed particularly happy or impressed with the upgrade. They had a not stunning update here, but it was part of the constant attempt to evolve the car and make it quicker. Alonso didn't seem unhappy with it, but Stroll said he had nothing positive to say about it after qualifying, which I thought was a bit pessimistic. So yeah, there was a bit of talk from the team about, Lance being a bit unfortunate. He lost some running in FP1, having, rakes added and removed from the car because he was doing the upgrade check-in on Friday, and that put him on a bit of the back foot. But you could argue that actually, well, the flip side is Alonso didn't have that car on Friday and then had to get used to it on Saturday.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, Lance Stroll, Suzuka's not really a circuit. He doesn't have a great record there by his standards, so I think that maybe played a part as well. The next question from Villa Nikari, who says, should Logan Sargent reversing onto the track be punished? It looks super dangerous and sketchy. I'll take that one. Ultimately, the cars do have a reverse gear for a reason. It's mandatory, and it was okay that he rejoined because it stopped the need for a safety car potentially and that kind of thing. It wasn't ideal because there were Piastri and Alonso coming. The only communication I had, I did check the onboard, was he was told sort of as he was reversing that Piastri and Alonso were coming and to watch out. He didn't seem to watch out hugely, although he did slightly pause before kind of dropping the clutch and heading off. So I think it was all right, a little bit dicey, but there are yellow flags. There would have been double yellow wave flags out there. They're there for a reason. It's probably easier to have a driver rejoining than just leaving it parked.
And the main thing to point out as well, or the other thing to point out rather, is that it is allowed. The only part you can't reverse is the pit lane, right? So We've seen it before. Remember Lewis Hamilton at Imola in 2021 when Mercedes was kind of guiding him back onto the track. So we've seen it before. You're right, it is a little bit sketchy sometimes, but it's within the rules. So yeah, there's no regulatory reason why he couldn't do it or should have been punished.
Next question, Mark, from Ben Hawkes. Could Norris have finished third, or did Ferrari have better performance and tyre deck?
The latter. It was quite clear, and Lando had track position over them because he'd done a better qualifying lap, but that was all. The Ferrari was clearly a much faster car with better tyre deg, and it was just, Sainz would have had to have done something wrong not to have beaten the McLaren.
Next up for you, Scott from Flavio Diomede. Now, this one is partly a statement, but worth a comment. Another week, another example of Mercedes seemingly lost its strategy.
It's a blunt observation. I would say I'm caught in two minds on it. In Mercedes' defence, I can see why when you're at the back of that group at the front, and it's so closely matched, and you're not 100% convinced of what kind of progress will be possible, then being offset with the after the red flag and giving yourself that flexibility, as they described it, to switch to either commit to the one stop or switch to the two stop. I can see the logic there, because if the one stop pays off, you're offset and you might actually be able to gain something that you wouldn't get through track position. So and that's not an illegitimate argument. I think there is some merit to that. But on the other hand, which I guess is what Flavio is kind of alluding to, it's more just you end up a little bit in no man's land and it doesn't work out because you lose so much time being overtaken and you don't really get a proper pit window to then react. So you just end up being a little bit lost.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very easy to just do the standard same thing as everybody else and therefore not be at risk of getting it wrong. But when you start in 7th and 9th, why the hell do that? When the option is there's a realistic option there that if you did something different, it might be rewarded. That is a far more logical choice from 7th and 9th than saying, let's do the standard thing and not risk getting it wrong.
Yeah, and especially with the lack of data in terms of the performance of the tyre and the conditions, etc. Yeah, it's definitely worth a go. A question I'll take now from Stuart Coulter, who says Alpine appeared to have made some progress after their dismal start in Bahrain, but today they seem to have regressed significantly. Did Suzuka exaggerate the weaknesses of their car, or were there any extenuating circumstances? Well, the car's just a bit slow. Actually, on qualifying pace, they were a little bit closer than Australia and Saudi Arabia based on percentage deficit, but the race was pretty poor. Okay, Gasly had some damage from, as he put it over the radio, Esteban hit me, but it was really Gasly hitting Ocon as he was trying to squeeze through a gap. So that held Gasly up. Ocon did what he could, but yeah, very much they were very much at the back, only ahead of Sargent because Sargent had that off. So it's just not a very good car, and they had a new nose and a few other bits and pieces, but it's not going to transform it just like that. And a track like Suzuka will expose a not very good car aerodynamically. So yeah, it just confirms there's not going to be a quick fix for Alpine. I think kind of around testing, they thought that maybe they might have enough here to start making a real difference and be a genuine Q2 car. But although Ocon was in Q2 this weekend, I don't think the Alpine can be said to be a genuine Q2 car. It's largely circumstantial. And Mark, I'll fire the last question at you from Jack Aitken, the Australian Jack Aitken, not the former Williams driver, who says Oscar Piastri really struggled with tyre wear during the 2023 Japanese Grand Prix. Did any of those issues linger today, and what learnings was he able to apply?
No, I don't think he was struggling so much with controlling the tyre deg this time. His tyre deg wasn't any worse than Lando Norris's. He was just a little bit off Lando's pace, and I think that all goes back to qualifying. The way that the car was behaving around here and the way you had to set it up to look after the tyres in the race. He just didn't get as much out of it as Lando did. It's quite a specific challenge around this place in particular, where it's not just about how hard you can push through the S's and all the traditional things that make this a great track, but it's also about combining that with not having the tyre overworked, even over one lap in qualifying. And it was the qualifying deficit really which defined his weekend, rather than any deficit in the race.
And I think it is interesting because Piastri's still in his second season only. He's early in his second season, and I think it shows how well Norris tends to put everything together, that there will be weekends like this. Obviously he ended up 8th with Norris 5th, where he looks like he struggles a little bit more and doesn't quite get as much out of the car, but that's going to happen because he's still building up that data bank, as you always put it, Mark. So yeah, it wasn't a great weekend, as he said after the race, and disappointing. He had that small error that let Russell pass right at the end, but still it could have been a lot worse, and he'll still keep on improving. Well, thanks very much to Mark and Scott for your insight, and thanks to everybody who sent in questions. We'll try and tackle some more of those in our midweek podcast, because once again, we've had an absolute deluge of them and we really appreciate that. Head to our website, plenty to read there. Listen to our other podcasts, including Bring Back V10s, which tells classic F1 stories, and the Race F1 Tech Show with Gary Anderson. Have a look at our YouTube channel as well. Well, there's a 2-week gap now until China, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.